Okay, so welcome to my professional expertise project for the breakdown of the article Vocabulary Acquisition through Close Exercises, Sentence Writing, and Composition Writing, which is written by Dee Zhao. So in this PowerPoint, we will have a couple sections that we're going to touch on, which is vocabulary, involvement load hypothesis, experiment, findings, impacts, and then the references to the article. So the first section that we're going to work with is the vocabulary, which is kind of the important words that you will need to know within this article in order for it to make sense. So the first vocabulary word that you will need to know in order for this article to make sense is what a task is. This study is researching the effectiveness of different tasks in learning, and so in order for that to make sense, you will need to know that a task is an activity that students or learners are given to help them practice a specific skill or to learn a different concept. So think of it as something that the learner will be doing. It's anything that the learner does in order to understand a specific skill. Involvement is the amount of interaction a student has with the task, meaning how much is being asked of them in order to complete that task. A close exercise is an educational practice. It's an activity where a sentence is missing several words, and then the learner will need to fill in those words based off of context clues. It could be based off notes, or it could be based off of a listening exercise. Processing is sort of a synonym for the act of learning. It's basically stating that when a student is processing something, they are in the process of learning, they are in the process of understanding that concept. And then a writing composition is a piece of writing that is a little bit longer. It's more thoroughly connected together, so it's different than a sentence writing because a sentence is just one phrase or sentence, whereas a writing composition is a piece of work. It could be a paragraph or longer. Our next section is about the involvement load hypothesis, where you will kind of understand a little bit more about what this hypothesis states and how it connects to Zhao's research. So the involvement load hypothesis states that the more interaction or involvement a learner has with a task or activity, the more they're going to receive and understand that task. So Zhao states that the involvement load hypothesis holds that in language learning, the retention of word knowledge is conditional upon its involvement load and how involved the student is in the word learning task. So basically, the more that a learner has to actually do something in the task, or the more thought process they have to have, the more they're going to receive from this task. So an example of this would be having students copy word definition or vocabulary words. While it might help them a little bit, it is not nearly as much learning involved as it would be if the student had to look up the vocabulary word, or if they had to connect it to another sentence, or if they had to match it. The more interaction, the more thinking, the more connection that the learner makes with that vocabulary word, the better it is going to be to help them understanding it. So this is the basis of which Zhao's research is conducted. We know that a higher involvement rate will lead to a higher retention rate, but Zhao really focused on investigating the retention rate of different types of activities and what their involvement load hypothesis connected with that. Our next section dives into the experiment and how the research was conducted to test the hypothesis. So before we kind of look at the process in which Zhao conducted this research, I went ahead and laid out the tasks that Zhao utilized. So they were aiming to test 3 different tasks against each other to see which had the best learning process rate. So the first task they utilized were closed sentences, where learners were instructed to determine correct vocabulary words by being given a glossary and plugging in the word that fit into that sentence. So they were given all information. All they had to do was plug in the correct word. Task 2 was learners were instructed to write a sentence for each vocabulary word using correct grammar. So again, given that definition, they had to create a sentence that made sense based off the vocabulary word. And then task 3, where learners were instructed to compose a paragraph utilizing all of the words correctly at the same time. So they had to find a way to either tell a story or give information and use the vocabulary words in one paragraph. Here are the details of the experiment. 147 students were split into 3 groups, with each group focusing on a specific task, being the closed sentences, the sentence writing, and the composition writing. Those students were considered intermediate English learners because they had been studying for 10 years. They were freshmen in college. They weren't younger children. They were somewhat experienced with learning English. So 3 weeks prior to the task completion, all participants were given a pretest to determine what they knew to kind of weed out any of the biases or discrepancies. And it actually turned out that most of the learners had zero knowledge of the vocabulary words. So they were all given the 10 vocabulary words, and they were pretty advanced words for them. And so because there were no outliers, they didn't have to remove any that way. After completing the task, roughly 30 members of each group were given a post-test after learning, and then some students were given a post-test a week later after the original post-test to determine the lasting effects. And this helped them to determine which tasks led to longer retention rates. And the data was collected in a triangular format to achieve those best results. So some students were interviewed, some students were tested, again, additionally the post-test after the post-test. Some students were taught how to complete a think aloud that showed them stating how they determined what word fit with what sentence or what close structure, or how they completed the task. So all of this allowed for Zhao to connect the data and the results to determine which task was most effective and why. Okay, so with scoring the tasks, the way Zhao decided whether or not a word was utilized correctly or not was there were 3 potential options. If a word was completely incorrect, the participant scored a 0. If the word did not make any sense, or it was used incorrectly, or it was not defined correctly, it was a 0. A semantically acceptable word, meaning that the word fit but maybe wasn't grammatically correct, would be scored as half a point. Or a synonym for the vocabulary word or the exact definition utilized perfectly would be scored as a full point. And all tasks were scored by 2 scorers in order to avoid bias, in order to avoid confusion, in order to make sure that there was legitimacy for all scorers. So our next section is going to be the findings. So what Zhao's research showed and how this connects to the hypothesis. So the results of this research showed that all 3 tasks led to word learning. And this is important to note because it does confirm that the closed sentences, the sentence writing, and the composition writing led to an understanding of the vocabulary words that the students did not have before. So all learners left understanding those 10 words more than they did when they first came in. What's interesting to note is that the composition writing task led to the highest learning retention, followed by the sentence writing and then the closed tasks. And while there was a large difference between the composition and the closed sentence task, there was also a large difference between the 2 writing tasks, the sentence writing and the composition writing. And this is something that we'll kind of talk about in a second about the reasons why there was a difference between the 2. And if you look at the chart below, it will show the testing results and the median result scores for how much the students were able to learn those 10 vocabulary words, separated by the close exercises, the sentence writing, and the composition writing. So what does this mean? The results of the study both support the involvement load hypothesis, but they also have results that do not necessarily support the hypothesis. So both of the writing tasks led to a higher learning rate, which supports the involvement load hypothesis. Because we know that the writing tasks, which were the sentence writing and the composition writing, those had a higher involvement rate. The students had to do more in order to complete those tasks. They had to be more involved. They had to take a vocabulary word, understand the definition of it, and use it correctly in a sentence, creating that sentence. And then for the composition, they had to not only create a sentence utilizing the vocabulary word correctly, but they had to then connect all those sentences together. However, the sentence writing and the composition writing had largely different scores, which is conflicting against the involvement load hypothesis because both of the writing tasks had similar involvement rates. So according to the involvement load hypothesis, because they had the same involvement rate, they should have had somewhat similar learning rates. But because there's a difference, this might be conflicting against the hypothesis, or it just means that there needs to be more research done on the tasks and the different effects of them. Next, we will be discussing the impacts of the research and what implication this research has on other populations. So, the impacts of the research can be threefold: the impacts to classroom practices, the impact to knowledge of language learning, and the impact for further research. The impact for classroom practices is very important because this research not only connects to a larger hypothesis, but it also connects to what a lot of teachers utilize in the classroom. So, utilizing the closed sentence structures, using the sentence writing, and using the composition writing in order to aid the vocabulary understanding in the classroom. This kind of gives us more information on which tasks work better and what we can use when it comes to teaching vocabulary. So teachers would benefit from this knowledge regarding which tasks to assign. If you are trying to create a longer lasting knowledge of a vocabulary word, it looks like the research shows that the composition writing would be best, and maybe closed sentences would be a little bit of an introduction to that vocabulary word. The impacts to the knowledge of language learning shows that our knowledge is growing from this research because we're able to see the process for how Zhao assessed which task would be better. This not only can be replicated utilizing different tasks, but it also shows us which involvement is going to be higher for which task and how much the students are able to understand and learn that new vocabulary. Also shows us, what their learning process is like. So the impacts to further research, as Zhao mentions, further research is going to be needed to be done with this. There is several different factors and several different reasons why maybe the data shows which task is better. There's a lot more questions that come from this research than just the original, which task is best for learners. So something that I would really love to see is the connection between the pre-task planning and the different factors like the time and the amount of organization each task had. So because some students took a little bit longer to complete their tasks, how did that affect their score? How did that affect their learning over time? How did that affect, their memory of the vocabulary words? And on our next slide, we have the references of Zhao's research. And a special thank you to Zhao for the extremely hard work that they put into this research and the writing of this article. Their detail and dedication was clear and evident. All right, and that concludes my discussion about the involvement load hypothesis and the article written by Zhao discussing the impacts of 3 separate tasks for these hypothesis. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear from them. Go ahead and leave a comment, or you can message me privately to discuss the article. Thank you so much.